Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the best breakout session of today and tomorrow. So we're going to talk a little bit about diversity in HCA. I am Dr. Senjuti Saha from Bangladesh. With me, I have Dr. Kian from Singapore. And we will start off this session with a couple minutes of a reminder of what we really mean by diversity and the current challenges in the field, and then we will dive into discussions.
Thank you, Senjuti. Hi, everyone. So you've seen a couple of versions of these plots. And I think what I just wanted to perhaps draw your attention to is that when we look at, say, the number of cells across self-reported ethnicity, more than half of these are actually unknown in terms of self-reported ethnicity. And even for those where we've got some metadata, it's really at the level of, say, European versus Asian. And, is that really that meaningful, or is that informative considering the scale of diversity or the breadth of diversity across Asia? So, Sanjiti and I were just chatting, and North India is probably going to be very different from, where we are in Hong Kong in terms of climate, in terms of perhaps air pollution at times, and in terms of diet and stuff like that. So really, these continental level descriptors of diversity are probably not granular enough to capture, I think, the full scale of human ancestry, of environment, of geography. And really, on the plots, on the graph on the right, even though the number of donors is climbing, we still have the non-European donors, so the vast majority of the world, really increasing at a slower rate compared to total donors as well as European donors. So what we have in this session is that we wanted to be able to get feedback from the community, to have a chat with you here in the audience in person, as well as those online in the Zoom session. And, we were both actually at the HCA general meeting where Senjuti spoke about some of the challenges and opportunities faced by the HCA regional network. So, for example, one of the first questions that we wanted to pitch to the audience was what kind of resources would be helpful for diversification of your cohorts, in addition to direct funding support. So Senjuti, for example, has had vast experiences building cohorts in Bangladesh, and you shared some of your experiences in the general meeting. And would you be able to tell the audience about some of your work over here?
Yeah, so thanks, Kian for that brilliant introduction. So we're going to talk about in this session, for this first question, we'll be talking about just not about funding challenges, but also some of the other challenges. So when we first started thinking of single cell genomics and doing all of that in Bangladesh, I really thought that money was the biggest obstacle. If I had money, I would be able to solve all single cell genomics problems, right? With money, I could buy machines, hire people. But then you realize there are these other challenges. For example, people don't understand single cell genomics at all. When I went and started talking to my collaborators, people were like, what is single cell genomics? Why is it even important? Then when we talk about building an atlas, you have to take samples from healthy people. Why would you poke healthy people, right? All our research has always been done at looking at disease. So how do you incorporate healthy samples in your studies? Problem with customs and importing machines. You could all have all the money, but not be able to import machines. And I could go on and on and on. But I also wanted to learn together with Kian on what are some of the challenges you think we could be facing in filling these gaps in diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And then The next question we wanted to focus on. So we're going to focus on the 3 bullet points in the interest of time. And then we've got time, we can talk about some of the questions 4, 5, and 6. So the second question we wanted to pitch also was, what kind of capabilities do we need to build across Asia, especially for underrepresented communities? So I think I had some, they're not here currently, but we had some, in the second row, we've had some members from our Thailand IDA team, where they've been able to actually bring single-cell genomics for the first time in different regions of Thailand. So they were seeding some of these opportunities in different regions in Thailand beyond Bangkok, so the urban center of Thailand. So one of the thoughts is that, bi-directional travel to help build capabilities across Asia is especially helpful for underrepresented communities. And we also wanted to throw it out there to see, what kind of feedback, what would be helpful in terms of capability building, capacity building, in addition to the workshops. And then do you want to talk a bit about disease? Because you mentioned in the last point, you can't just poke healthy people. And that was the point that we wanted to gather feedback about.
Yeah. So, when we are talking about diversity, when we are talking about resources and really including this underrepresented population, it also means going into places where resources are very, very limited, where you're stretching a little bit of resources to do a lot of research or as much research as possible. And in those cases, you want to use those research optimally, create this virtuous cycle where limited resources can be used to generate the most amount of data. But at the same time, you want to ensure that all the data that are generated, research that is done, can be applied, right? So, research that has immediate, at least, immediate or at least during our lifetime, impact or benefits on population health. And that often means looking at people who are sick, looking at diseases that have the highest burden. But also, we have to realize that in order to understand what is changing disease, we have to understand what is normal, what is health, right? So we have to look at them in parallel. In many of the resource constrained settings, there are still diseases that are rampant, starting with infectious diseases. So as populations are aging, to other chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, etc. So these are, I think, becoming very, very important for our resource constrained settings. So something to talk about there too.
Definitely. So in terms of the format, so what we have is that in case you're a bit shy to speak up, but we're quite a small tight-knit group over here. So please feel free to voice out. I think there'll be a mic, and one of our event organizers will pass the mic around if you wanted to voice out your feedback on any of the questions. The second thing is we've got this pigeonhole link, so you can look at some of the questions, some of the feedback, upvote, downvote, in case you prefer to be able to type virtually. And then I know Bridget is also helping us to take a look at the Zoom attendees. So and please feel free to unmute also if you'd like to chat. So I'll just leave this here for a couple more seconds to scan this before we go back and then start talking from the first question onwards. So I'll just leave it for a couple more seconds. And then, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. So I'm going to offer one perspective, and then Senjuti can continue. So, for example, taking the Asian Immune Diversity Atlas, we actually have a definition of no chronic medication, so excluding anyone with active infection, recent vaccination. So we wanted to capture the baseline healthy states, but we actually know that that's not going to be truly measurable or truly easy to sample in different regions. So actually in the row behind you, we've got some of our colleagues and friends from the Indonesian Atlas project, where it's impossible to find someone who hasn't had some kind of exposure to parasitic or to infectious diseases. So there, instead of a healthy baseline, they're capturing population variation or perhaps the population baseline. So I would say that it's important to specify in your project whether you're looking, what kind of healthy criteria you're using. So in the case of either, we have those exclusion criteria specifically stated, or depending on which environment you are, maybe it's better to specify as the population baseline or population average. And Senjuti?
I think that was perfectly, that was the perfect answer. Healthy depends, right? Healthy in Berlin is very different than healthy in Shanghai. It's very different than healthy in Dhaka, which is one of the most populated cities in the world. So the nasal mucosa of a healthy person in the most polluted and populated city in the world is going to be very different than a small town in North America. So you are absolutely spot on. And that's why diversity is so, so important.
Yep. And maybe we can count that as something to answer the first point. So it's, what kind of resources would be helpful? Maybe it would be helpful to share some of these criteria more broadly, as you saw some of the QR codes from Chloe about resources. So we're happy to perhaps advocate and propose that cohorts that have already been built share some of this information to help enable cohort building by future projects. So that we're going to report back on some of our discussions, and that's something we can put in about 1 hour to the audience.
So I think there's a very good reason why we're doing this meeting in Hong Kong, which is because of increasing geopolitical tensions. In conjunction with that, I think China generates a lot of single cell data from Asian peoples, but they are not included in HCA data sets for reasons that you might imagine. There's some concern on both sides about the implications and so on. Even if you tell people it's not the full genomic data, it's just the cell by gene matrix representation or whatever, there are these concerns. So how can we collectively work around that so that all of this valuable data can be included and have ethical guidelines so that people feel comfortable with this? I think this is something also, if we could discuss that, would be great, because I know a lot of the PIs here from mainland have this concern.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's actually very important. So in fact, there is actually I'm going to combine that with a comment that we see on the pigeonhole. So for example, for self-reported ethnicity, can participants opt out, for example? So there are certain metadata fields that even projects, perhaps not within, even in addition to the concerns, the very legitimate concerns they have in mainland China, there are also other regions that have sensitivities, local sensitivities. So one of the thoughts that we have is that for certain sensitive metadata fields like collection site location, like self-reported ethnicity, in some places gender, self-reported gender can be sensitive. I think we give participants the option to just not provide information, and for data contributors to not provide that information. So we emphasize that this should be consistent with local IRB approvals, and that there really should be a process of community engagement to understand the local sensitivities of the communities and how best to report their descriptors. So maybe formulating, a set of examples of how people have reported this metadata, and then consulting perhaps more extensively on what's possible to share, what are the risks of sharing, what are the benefits of sharing. Would that help to clarify the situation, or to enable these investigators to have more confidence in sharing? Or is it purely a legal matter, do you think?
Partially a legal matter, I think. How do we make the data usable but still formatted or curated in a way that is complies with local laws and regulations? There's a lot of talk about like using AI, for example, like federated learning or something like this, so that data can be leveraged but not leave the border.
Yeah.
I think not leaving the border is something very important for mainland China at the moment.
Yeah.
The other point I want to raise is, this is HCA Asia, and I think historically there has also been concerns of certain races or ethnicities providing resources to gather data from the less, I should say less represented ethnicities, this being used for problematic reasons. So I think this is also something I would like to have people think about, or maybe discuss how we can approach that as the community that is currently not well represented, but also perhaps lacking resources.
I think that's a very good point. And if I understand, it's kind of like, we often talk about colonialism in science of the global north and the global south, but even if we just look at the global south, there is this disparity where certain populations are clearly more benefited, and other underrepresented populations are just sample donors, and they never get to practice science and definitely do not get the benefits of science. This is a very, very good concern. And I think this is really important that we already start having these discussions, because 10 years down the line, we don't want to have like the same problem, but within Asia. that, oh, these are not only North European descendants anymore, but these are like certain populations who either did all of the sequencing or, benefited from the data. I think these are also concerns when it comes to, long-term benefits of, let's say, single-cell genomics. Pathogen genomics came way before single-cell genomics, and there are very good examples of how things went wrong, right? How, like, let's say the flu virus was sequenced from certain parts of the world, vaccines were designed, and the people who gave those samples for flu virus never actually had access to the vaccines, right? So I think these are problems that we should learn from, that have been solved, or like at least being discussed more broadly in other fields, and think about how not to face the same problems here. And very similar to data sharing also, I think things are just going to get more and more difficult geopolitically, sharing data, ethically sharing data, using that data, and also the population or the number of scientists are increasing in the world. Trust is decreasing overall. So how do we deal with that again? When are the times we should be sharing data? Is there a wartime? Is there a peacetime? Is data from COVID, single-cell genomics data during COVID considered wartime data that must be shared immediately for benefits to the entire world? And at other times, is it not wartime data? Is it peacetime data when we can share data whenever we want as scientists, right? So I think these are very, very important discussions and should be embedded into our diversity team.
I'd like to pick up on that. So there's no doubt that the diversity is needed, not only in single cell, even the GWAS, like from Drew presentation earlier, that's GWAS, that's much cheaper than technology-wise than single cell. Underrepresented populations in non-Europeans is really, really low and so really high. I mean, the underrepresentation is really high. But if you wanted to diverge or put more investigation in the diversifying the diversity of our samples, there are two things related to that. The first one is the community itself that we want to get the sample from, and the local collaborators, right, that we want to work with to get the samples from the community. So I'd like to touch upon these two things. So, in Indonesia, the models that we try to apply before we do sampling is to do in-depth community engagement. And in that community engagement, we ask, how can we help with our research to the need of the community, and also the benefit sharing as well. For example, when we do our research in the eastern part of Indonesia, for example, they might need access to the health facility. They might need access to education. They might need to access to some health checks, for example, because it's different from Singapore or from other part of the world that can have easily access to the health facilities. So that's what it's related to the number one, like direct funding support, that we need to allocate like a big chunk of the budget to the benefit sharing and proper benefit sharing and community engagement. First of all, if you work with the hunter-gatherer population, they don't need health access. They don't need education in a way because they can live their way of life happily. But they need, for example, their forests to be protected. That's something that we can also, it's unrelated to the work that we do, but when we need to approach them, we kind of have to find a way to help them in the way that they need eventually. So that's my first point. Like my first strong point is that from what experience that we do in Indonesia, is that we need to really do like a proper community engagement in whatever study we do, genetics, like a GWAS, health, and single cell, whatever, it's the same. It's the good community engagement, and then ask the people what they need and how we can allocate our money and our research for them. And then the second one is the local collaborators. Sometimes they ask, we want to collaborate with the local researchers as I would say, I don't know, sample donors, some sample providers, you know what I mean? But there's no capacity building that the like scientific colonialism. There's no capacity building to the local collaborators, to the technology, to the capacity to do analysis of the data that can be absorbed that can be learned by the local collaborators. So that's also related to the funding support that maybe we have to allocate as well some funding, some allocations to proper capacity building to the local collaborators, and I don't know, like provide scholarships for the local collaborators to do PhD in one of the labs that you do the single cell analysis, whatever, and maybe I don't know, invite them to do some short fellowships and get them to learn how to do analysis, or you do workshops in situ in the country that you are working. So these two sides of diversifying data, diversifying samples, I think is something that we need to really take a careful look at, in my opinion.
Thank you, Pai. I think those are two really important points. So if I might summarize, really, the first is community engagement in a manner that meets local needs. So it's not helicoptering and saying that, oh, you need this, you need that, but listening to them. So, the example you said of forest management for these hunter-gatherers, and maybe because these involves to a certain extent public services. So to a certain extent, maybe that actually ties in with the previous point about how you need to speak with government or understand some of the legal implications of the framework. So one of the things that actually came up in the general meeting was that people wanted the HCA to provide some text to explain the mission of the HCA in order to be able to show to local government authorities saying, oh, this is what the HCA wants to do, wants to support. So wants to support this comprehensive reference map of cells for health and disease. So I think being able to explain this to communities, bring targeted benefits to communities to meet their needs, and to be able to communicate with local government authorities on what the HCA wants to do, and to try and help them understand what we're trying to share. I think the second point is also well taken, and something that we should report back on, that local capacity building is important. So taking the IDA project, for example, for our newer single cell teams, we work one-on-one with them to step through actually their single cell data sets, analyze them. I know for Bangladesh, Yogesh went to Boston, for example. So there's efforts to do bi-directional travel. Is that the case?
Yes, absolutely. I think point spot on. So something else I would also, I think, add to the first point is with diversity comes equity. I think what you're trying to also get at, and that's really, really important. And donors needs to be aware of that when we budget, we're not only budgeting for machines and regions and salaries, but also budgeting for community engagement, ensuring that in some way the community actually gets something back, such that when we leave, when the study is done, when that 1 year long study is done, they're not left at the same place. They actually get something out of that study, and that could be education on forest management, whatever is required by the community. So even before we go to the donor, I think it's important that we start engaging with the community, and the community, instead of donor driving the agenda, the community kind of drives the agenda, and that's reflected in the budget, that's reflected in how donor interacts with the communities. If I understand, that's also another point, ensuring that when that item line is there in the budget, the donor doesn't come back to us and say, hey, this is not what we fund, but they have to fund if you really, really want diversity. And I think the second point, as you said, is so important. One example you gave was like, how in our team now we have people, you gave, your example of IDA and working one-to-one. And in our team, we are doing this exchanges. But again, I think those examples are very rare, Kian Hong, when we work with the Global North. Very, very rare examples where both parties actually benefit equally. I think this should be like something that we can take back. I think that there should be very, very good, clear, ethical guidelines of collaborations, saying that, there should be understanding that when we collaborate, let's say with a very small island, just trying to develop research, when the study is done, that research institute, that research center is again left behind with something, and this should also be decided prior to the research even starts. And oftentimes it's education, PhD, but also after a PhD, sustenance of that, will they get like other small grant so that not every time samples are shipped out, not every time, yes, doing it the first time, second time, fine, but are we going to do it the next 10 times? No, that makes no sense. Then capacity will never be built. So I think there should be very, very good ethical guidelines for collaborations and capacity building. And that is something we should definitely take back.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's good.
I just want to quickly tag on to this because so my students, Angelica and Michael, we've been doing some research in Madagascar, not health related, but actually I think some of the parallels apply there where we're going in there to leverage the resources there for research, but we want to leave something for the local people. I wonder if actually, if you're doing a project related to health, that you could, with that, with the funding support, build in some slice of it for healthcare. So diagnostic, or, if you're doing sequencing and you're building a simple sequencing lab there, could we build in some dollars that get banked for people to get free diagnostics of some kind? Or if a pandemic or some kind of seasonal, virus comes in, we can use it just to provide free diagnostics. That might be a way to give back kind of directly through the project. So for every sample we take, some dollar goes to healthcare.
I think that's really interesting. So yeah, one of the things that we had this sort of brainstorming session in the general meeting, the pandemic surveillance, for example, that's one of the sort of the things that we always were concerned about, right? So perhaps one of the goals that we have recommended as a diversity task force is to expand the number of tissues. So you heard Sham say that for blood, we want to go to 50 countries. And then for nasal swabs and skin, because these are more easily accessible tissues, we want to expand them to at least 10, I think 10 countries per bio-network. So those sound like they could be paired in terms of the diagnostics, because to do nasal swabs, I mean, that's the foundation for the COVID test that we've all been through before. So I think very smart pairing of this together with the diversity goals, that's a great idea. Thank you for that. Yeah.
So I would like to add on the points about community engagement and the capacity building. So I want to speak from the perspective of getting tissue samples. So I think one of the major challenges of tissue samples is that if you want intact cells for single cell sequencing from tissue samples, sometimes it's very challenging to process the tissue on site. You will need like a certain level of laboratory like BSL2 and centrifuge and so on. So to add on to the point of capacity building, I think protocol development and protocol sharing is very important. For example, there are some biopsies that needs to be performed at the hospitals, and clinicians will have to fix the samples in formalin in some way. So if we can meet them halfway, for example, like they fix the samples in formalin, but we might need to talk to them, like how do they usually process the samples? And if we need some extra steps to be done that is within like their settings or facilities, and we take that samples to process at the more proper laboratory, that would be great. And maybe we can share the protocols with them, like maybe you like add a little bit more steps, and because it's already in the diagnosis procedure, the biopsies. So I think it's like kind of win-win situation.
That's a good point. I wanted to say one thing, and then I think Senjuti, I know what Senjuti has to say. I think I know where Senjuti is going that, because she's got one of the CCI Next Gen grants helping that. So maybe we've got protocols.io, we've got a HCA section, for example, but it sounds like maybe we need to do a better job of communicating them, or perhaps developing these protocols. So do you think, sort of, in addition to making them available as a resource, what other things could help, to make these protocols more accessible? Do you think sort of video style protocols like Jove, is that what you might be suggesting?
I think like sometimes clinicians are not aware of what like researchers are doing, and they didn't consider, like it was not in their awareness that what benefits can these samples be done in a much higher level. So I think first of all, like communications, like, okay, we are doing this kind of research and these tissues are very precious and this information can be generated by these samples. And so we can like, communicate and meet halfway.
So better clarity, better communication, and really showing what possibilities there are. Do you want
Yes.
to talk about Jacqueline's stuff? You know, was Jacqueline involved in bringing the next gen protocol, the protocols to?
Yeah, I think there is perhaps something else that I am also getting out of on the point that you're making is one, the protocols are always in silos. We work in silos, right? Researchers work in labs, doctors work in, hospitals. Only when we need samples, we're like, hey, doctor, give me samples. But there should be more of a communication where they are aware of what's happening and the benefits. But I think so communication is definitely one thing, and Kian Hong already mentioned that there is protocols.io of HCA specifically, where a lot of these protocols are beautifully open accessly shared in the form of open access. I think something else that you're pointing out is very important also in resource poor settings is oftentimes these protocols are designed by the best labs with the best resources. I think that is what you're kind of getting at, right? Yes, they are shared. Let's say they are communicated, but a hospital in Rwanda doesn't have, no matter how clear that protocol is, there is no way they will be able to replicate that. I think what you're meaning to say is like, let's meet them halfway, that they already do some things instead of saying, hey, go back to step 0 and do everything my way to get that perfect single cell data. What are you doing now? Okay, how can single cell community work with them and design a protocol that is relevant for that hospital in Rwanda? And this might be different for a protocol that's developed for a hospital in my city, Dhaka, right? I think that's a really good point that protocols are designed assuming you have everything. Why don't we start designing a protocols based on what's there and how do we optimize each of those steps? It's a very good point.
Thank you for that. And are there any other? So maybe if you want to, because we've got limited time to try and in this breakout, so maybe you could wrap up the first question. So are there any other things that people first and second together? Yeah, so first and second together, are there any other resources that would help in diversification of cohorts? And other, we heard about from Pai about really local capacity building. So being able to train the local bioinformatics experiments, like meeting better clarity, communication of protocols, adjusting protocols and meeting them for resource poor settings. So are there any other capabilities, capacities that we should be, telling the community that we need to focus on? And what other resources would be helpful for diversification in addition to perhaps advice, speaking of governments, meeting local needs, and any other thoughts on the first two questions? Bridget, anything on the Zoom or okay? Thank you. Yeah, the hybrid participants online, please feel free to voice out.
Involving anthropologists if you really want to work with the like underrepresented communities. Like for example, in Indonesia, Jakarta it's a big city, but it's underrepresented. But it's easy for us to talk to the Jakartans, for example, the metropolitan citizens. But for the underrepresented in living in remote areas, you need someone who can talk their culture, talk their mind, talk their language, maybe.
Yeah.
So I think the mind of anthropologist or someone who knows the community well, that might help you well.
That's a very good point. So I think that this highlights the urban-rural divide because when we think, you heard a lot about ancestral diversity, and Drew gave a very elegant talk talking about the continental level. I think sort of influences as well as continuous measures. But then there's also environmental diversity. And one of the 10-year goals we set for the HCA is that we should aim to improve our representation of rural, marginalized communities. And I think maybe special attention to rural communities and how we engage non-urban donors. I think that's something that we can report back on. So working with anthropologists. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the first 2 points? Okay, then maybe what we'll do is that we've heard quite a bit about disease today, and we know there's also a separate disease breakout session. But one of the things we did want to touch upon was that Senjuti spoke about this. You can't poke a healthy person in many countries just because you have this sort of fundamental science interests or basic science interests. So what kind of diseases would be helpful or good to prioritize across Asian healthy controls, or sorry, Asian populations in order to maximize benefit to local communities? So are there particular diseases where you think you've got expertise in and would be good across multiple Asian countries? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. I think that's important. So we definitely want to make sure we meet local needs similar to how we engage populations. I think one of the things we're thinking about in the HCA is that are there particular sort of shared priorities across multiple countries? Yeah, that maybe we can coalesce upon, because I think, for example, one of the things that was heard is that you can't fund every single disease. And as a consortium, if we coalesce together to focus on the few to start, I think maybe they can demonstrate benefit and then bring forward additional projects. So are there diseases that would be of interest? So infectious diseases, for example, dengue, I think we had chikungunya in tropical regions. Yeah.
Maybe we could go around the room, and that way everybody will be forced to speak. You say the name of your country and your favorite disease, and we can do it a couple of times till we run out of diseases, and then we see which disease wins for today.
Could be one way. Pai, do you want to start? So we'll go from the left, left to right maybe. Monica and Pai?
Okay, hi. Hi everyone. I'm Monica from Indonesia. I'm with Pai and also Andreas. So we're on the same project for the single cell. Currently, I'm presenting poster about tailored community engagement. Please feel free to visit. So favorite disease, I mean, in Indonesia is very diverse of disease, but for our current project, it's very high in malaria and dengue. So it's very sexy disease to be studied on Indonesia, but there are more disease like TB that maybe, okay, I'll choose malaria.
Okay.
Yeah, malaria or lifestyle related diseases.
So like type 2 diabetes, for example.
One of them, yeah. And cardiovascular, but yeah.
Oh, my name is Bao Hudong. I'm from China. And I have a research article focused on brain stroke. And my grandfather had it, so that's why I choose this.
So cardiovascular disorders. Yeah, Drew?
Hi, Drew Naven, Garvin Institute in Sydney. Bipolar disorder.
Okay, so sort of psychiatric.
So hi, I'm also from China, and I don't work with any disease, but I propose tuberculosis, and I think that's the second most infectious diseases in the world.
Mhm.
So I'm from Japan. Almost 20 years ago, we started a cancer genome project, international collaborations. At times, Japan is selected liver cancer and liver disease. 20 years ago.
Mhm.
But now I'm now personally interested in like aging disease, like the Japanese population that more the age and like dementia or psychological disease. I'm interested in that.
Mhm. Thank you.
Okay, hello, I'm Xinze, also from China, and I think my favorite disease for regional disease in research maybe some neurodegenerative disease and also the gut cancers. Yeah.
So far it sounds like we've heard some, infectious diseases, psychiatric diseases, cancer, and then over the
I'm Chichi, originally from China and studying in Melbourne. And I think in Australia, like Parkinson disease is a big one. And as a Chinese, I think cardiovascular disease is definitely like happen more often to Chinese population. Like my family got like blood clotting issues and yeah, like that.
Hello. Hello, I'm Andreas. Also from Indonesia. Maybe I'll go with kidney disease related to the lifestyle of the people, also to drink so much let's say instant drink, something like that.
at the back. Do you want? Oh, we'll come to you eventually. Am I you? Okay.
I'm Feifeng Li from China, and I'm gonna go with dengue fever.
Dengue.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Ben. I'm from Thailand. For our country, we have like non-communicable disease like the cardiovascular and cancer, and also the infectious disease like COVID, dengue that we are focusing on.
Ananya from Thailand. So actually I work with dental pulp, the toothache. So probably not limited to Asia.
Yeah. And is there one more? Or... Oh, over here.
Can I also say
Yeah,
something?
of course.
I'm also from Indonesia, but I'm working in Hong Kong, and we lost a huge part of my dad's side of the family to hepatitis. So yeah, hepatitis.
So like viral caused or
Yeah,
viral
which
diseases?
it eventually led to cancer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've got really a few broad categories: lifestyle related disorders, immune, I think neuropsychiatric. So it sounds like maybe one other thing we could think about when we report back is to think about what's feasible in the near term and the longer term, because and all of these things would take. I like to imagine them as happening in parallel, and that you probably need more capacity building for tissue sampling, for example. So to be able to access some of these, liver cancer you mentioned in Japan, and cardiovascular tissue, these probably require a lot more careful engagement. And because there's some sensitivity around tissue donation, I think someone I spoke to at the general meeting say that sometimes it's harder for Asian donors to donate tissue because of, I think, sensitivities or cultural reasons. So maybe sort of in the near term, infectious diseases could probably be the lower hanging fruit, not necessarily the lowest because they're all challenging in some extent. So infectious diseases is one layer. And then also working on these other aspects. How does that sound to you, Senjuti?
Look, I am a microbiologist. So when you say infectious diseases, I'm like, which infectious disease? There's so many. How do you prioritize infectious diseases, right? So what I think I got out of this discussion that as scientists, we have our personal interests, right? And we will always fight for our personal interests. So there has to be a way of figuring out what are actually local priorities and having funding schemes for those. And it is going to be different. Like we cannot expect developed countries, developing countries to have similar priorities. It was very clear, I think, based on which country they're from, right? Which country you're from, what was the priority? Like, low resource countries still have a high infectious disease burden, whereas more high resource countries have more non-communicable disease problems. I think HCA has to figure out a way of how to engage with the entire community and come up with some kind of strategic priorities of diseases. And this is again, strategic priorities of diseases. This is again not new to the field, right? When we think of, industries investing on vaccines, there are groups in WHO whose literally only job is to engage with countries, engage with scientific advisory boards and governments to figure out what are the 15 vaccines that the world should invest in the next 15 years. So I think that can be like a similar process that HCA engages in. Yeah.
I think that's very important. One of the things we'd like to invite you to continue to the conversation is that if you've got any further questions or any further thoughts about these diseases, to post them onto the Pigeonhole link, and we'll keep responding to them. And I also think maybe to place this in the context of some of the HCA goals. So in the near 5-year term, we've got blood, nasal swabs, I think skin, one other bionetwork, but we also want to be able to capture, I think, all the diseases in the longer term. And I think we need to start now if we want to do that. So to think about the lifestyle diseases, the cardiovascular diseases, I think the psychiatric disorders that you need. So we would love to be able to continue the conversation afterwards and be able to report this back to the HCA Executive Committee. So any other thoughts on Jude?
The other thing that kind of occurs to me is some mechanism of matchmaking across different countries, and yes, a dating app for disease interests and research interests. This happens somewhat naturally, but this could be potentially an opportunity for HCA to build a bit of a foundation here, so that these collaborations can start. And then sometimes there are funding bodies that are meant for international collaboration. So it allows us then to find additional areas of funding where we can work across multiple countries.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing to kind of build into the infrastructure here for HCA that would be really helpful.
I think that's great. And then, so within HCA Asia and also across the networks, because I know that dengue, for example, is a concern in Latin America. I know Mexico, they had huge efforts to look at lifestyle diseases like type 2 diabetes. So definitely Pai.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
Since you want to increase diversity, you want to deliver well as well, right? I mean, we don't want to do, like, for example, Parkinson's disease in Indonesia because it's not that targeted. So we might want to do like common locally, but rare globally. Some things that, like I said, like Drew mentioned earlier, that we can focus on something that is common locally, but rare globally, and then focus on that, and then we can diversify the sample, the sample origins, but we can deliver something directly to that particular groups that is underrepresented. You know what I mean?
That's a good point. Maybe if I were to riff on that, one of the things we were thinking about was that, if we're able to compare, say, two populations, one where, perhaps disease incidence is higher, disease incidence, the tendency is prevalence is lower. Are there sort of environmental factors or contributing factors that could contribute to different disease susceptibility or different prevalence? So being able to compare this common locally and then perhaps rare in another region to do these paired comparisons. Senjuti?
Oh, got it.
Yeah. Okay. And any other thoughts on disease that we've got maybe 5 minutes, I think, left in this session before we return you to was it a break, Bridget? Yes. Okay. So maybe in the last 5 minutes, any thoughts on disease before we wrap up?
I just have a thought of like, maybe before of considering like what are the other diseases that what we want to capture, probably report the community what's the setup code of the disease that we are capturing. So by having that summary statistic, probably we can use that to maybe like reach out to the local government, like the health department, to kind of get their summary statistics of like what's the most like prevalence diseases in that country going to be helpful. And I think that's also like come to like making the data more transparent and also like engage to like like clinicians, donors, government bodies to like talk more about like what we mean by like diversity. So I think there are so many measurements. So disease is one, and also as you covered before, like geography and also ethnicities, they are like, yeah, I'm just thinking like having a like infrastructure that we can have all those summary statistics that we can know where the gap is. And I have another thought on just like getting the samples. So as you say before, I think there are some like low-hanging fruit, like nasal swab and blood and blah, 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 because I'm from a stem cell field. So we think like by making like induced pluripotent stem cells just from skin biopsy or urine or blood gonna be helpful because that can be differentiated into so many cell types in human body. So I'm aware that HCA already like including like organoids into the network. So yeah, I think that can be another solutions for getting those cell types that just like so hard to get from a live human body, or yeah, so hard to culture in vitro. So yeah, that's just my thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So if I may summarize, sort of accessibility of information, being able to develop disease models and also make more use out of the samples that people are collecting in order to perhaps think about modeling of disease. And one thing maybe to sort of follow up on that is that there are some WHO data that we showed this morning, so the disability adjusted life years. But I agree, sort of engaging with local governments on epidemiology, I guess you're referring to, or disease incidents locally, that would be helpful. Yeah. And then I also wanted to, there's one question in the chat about, is there a goal for representation of each ethnicity, ancestry to be representative or equal? So I think, it's hard to be equal given that where we are starting from. If I go back, it's really hard to think about us catching up with the total European donors, even though Europeans are perhaps 15% of the global population. So I think I like to think of it in terms of what's achievable immediately and what we should keep striving towards. So I think year on year, atlas on atlas, improvements in representation. And in fact, there's some thought that maybe you might need to oversample certain populations. So in Singapore, it's 75% Chinese, around 15% Malays, 8% Indians. But in the either cohort, we try to make them approximately one-third in order to be able to compare population group differences. So, I think we have to think about it very carefully in each context and to really strive for year-on-year improvements. So we've got 1 more minute left. And Senjuti, would you like to add any closing remarks for the audience here?
I'm so surprised that nobody said, why does it cost more to do single cell genomics in low resource countries compared to high resource countries? It costs so much more because of tax barriers, because of no distributor in our country, right? We have like these private distributors who buy it from another country, take a profit, and then sell it to us. I think those are also issues that we need to, again, bring up in the HCA, because unless we do that, there is no way we can increase diversity. I think it was very beautifully pointed out right in the beginning that in order to increase diversity, at the end of the day, we have to ensure people can practice science, have equitable access to practicing science, and equitable access to the benefits of science. And for that, in addition to funding, we also have to ensure there are these local policies so that we have access to the resources. But I think this was really, really good. And we made everybody speak, which I feel very proud of.
Great idea.
Oh, thank you, always. But otherwise, I think community engagement comes up in every meeting. We have to be better at community engagement. It has to be a big part of what HCA does. So we talked about community engagement. We talked about benefits, immediate benefits to the local community. So that's a step beyond community engagement, and we have to think about that. I really liked that point about protocols and actually changing protocols, optimizing protocols, such that even low resource communities have access to those protocols. And I think we have to do something about it. And there should be protocol sharing. Like, we have now developed all of these protocols to do work in Bangladesh, but I just realized we have never shared them with anybody, right? So now it's like my responsibility also, and we have to ensure we realize that diversity in our interests is a lot. We have to somehow figure out how to prioritize where most funding should go or interest should go. And at the end of everything, I think that summarizes everything, is we need a dating app. We need collaborators to figure out who likes what, who has what expertise, because at the end of the day, we need those win-win situations. We need those equitable exchanges. Some people have technology, others have samples, some people have protocols, others have machines. And so we really need to figure out, or, different people can be interested in the same diseases. We need to figure out how to find ourselves the right partners in crime.
Yeah,
That's it from me.
That's great. And to close off the session, so just a reminder, please feel free to give us feedback. We also have a poster, so that's D134 over there, and you can take a look at the Diversity Task Force recommendations in detail. And we're happy to keep chatting with you over the course of the next 2 days. And we'll summarize. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. They're very important, and we'll summarize and report back to the entire group in 1.5 hours. So with that, I hope you enjoy your coffee break. And we're looking forward to connecting over the course of the next 2 days. Vijay, is that 20 minutes? Okay. Thank you very much.
Tell everyone that this was the best session and they missed out on the best session.
Okay.